Hey there, welcome back to the Uncovered Dish Christian Leadership Podcast, the podcast that uncovers stories, equips leaders, and changes the world. And we are your hosts, James Lee
and Gabby Corbett.
And today we have a very special guest with us, the Reverend Dr. Gil Rendle. Gil is a renowned consultant, author, and speaker with extensive experience in congregational leadership and church development. Gil has served as a senior vice president and consultant with the Texas Methodist Foundation and as a senior consultant for the Alvin Institute. He is an ordained United Methodist minister, and he pastored many different congregations and consulted on change and leadership within the denominations. Gil has authored numerous influential books, including Journey in the Wilderness and Doing the Math of Mission, and most recently, Countercultural, Subversive Resistance, and the Neighborhood Congregation. Gil, thank you so much for joining us on the Uncovered Dish podcast.
Pleasure, James. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'm going to softball you a question to start us off with. So as you sort of reflect on all of your journey and all the things that you've been a part of and the research that you've done, what is congregational leadership? And how do we do it well? If you were going to give us like the top 3 things on how to do congregational leadership well.
Well, Gabby, that's a far cry from a softball question.
My job.
Yeah, congregational leadership, I really do believe is kind of a spiritual journey for people, and it really requires finding yourself and finding the purpose of the congregation and aligning it with what you understand to be the truth of the gospel. And so none of that is easy work, especially in a changing culture. I think that, if I were to kind of reduce it down to a couple of things that are really critical to do that kind of leadership, one of the arguments that I've made in one of my earlier books that still stands very much at the heart of my work is that you have to be able to continuously re-answer certain questions. And the questions that quite often frame the work that I do is, who are we now? Which is a question of identity. Do we even understand who we are? Most congregations think of themselves from an earlier time. They don't really attend to who they are right now and where they are right now. As a matter of fact, even as a person, I think of myself as younger than I am. I know more about who I was than about who I am. Well, if you're going to lead, you have to lead out of that identity of who you are now. And then the second of those questions would be, what has God called us to do now? Well, not what God called us to do in the past. But again, this is really linked to the fact that we're living in such a fast-changing world, was captured by the notion of a liquid culture. Bauman, a Polish sociologist, would talk about this, that we're living in a world now that is changing so fast that by the time we come up with an appropriate response to whatever problem or condition we framed, by the time we implement our solution, the world has changed again.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, okay, in that kind of changing environment and everything, what does God call us to do now? Let's not talk about what we've always done. That's one of the other issues that, is always at the heart of, well-established, tradition-bound congregations. So who are we now? What has God called us to do now? And who is our neighbor now? What's the context? And so, these are fundamentally questions of identity, purpose, and context. And so in this spiritual journey that the congregation is on and that the leader is trying to help them through, there is this constant conversation that has to happen, around these issues: identity, purpose, and context. So that's as close as I'm going to come to a softball question answer, because from there you have to go down into the details for sure.
No, it's a
Right.
perfect opening to our conversation. Yeah.
And so, speaking on the now, in this sort of liquid culture, if you will, you also in your teachings and your writing, you call this now, this current historic moment, you call it a cultural turning point. And so, how has your leadership advice evolved in response to the ever-changing liquid, if you will, current historic moment?
when I talk about a turning, I'm really looking at the work of some of our historical historians or cyclical historians. That there is a way of looking at so many of the systems of our lives, cyclical, kind of repeating patterns. If an oscillating pattern is one that has an upper limit and a lower limit, and the system kind of varies in between those two and oscillates back and forth between the extremes. Well, one of the things that has been pointed out by our historians is that the culture has always oscillated between an orientation toward the communal, toward the we. And once the culture becomes too glommed around we, too consensual around we, so that people don't feel that they have individual freedoms, then they begin to kind of stretch out and try to find their own individual expressions, and they move toward the I. And so, we move in between a culture that has moments of cohesiveness, the way that we used to have in the United States back in the 1950s, in which everything was the same, and if you weren't the same, you tried to behave or look as if you were. You wanted to fit in. The 1960s broke us out of that. The search for personal freedoms.
Yeah.
In fact, that has moved us to the point, along with a whole lot of other issues, until most of the attention is given to the individual now and not to the community, not to the group, not to the cohesiveness. We are at one of our least cohesive moments as a people. And one of the things that prompts is we are at one of our least civil moments as a people. And part of what that means is that we are at one of our most divided moments as a people, because everybody has the freedom to choose their own truth. Everybody has a freedom to go their own way. Everybody has a freedom to try to capture whatever they want, as long as they don't intrude on other individuals. And so we have been going through this oscillating time. If the 1950s was the extreme of the cohesiveness of the time of the we, a lot of historians and a lot of political commentators right now are talking about we are now at the extreme of the I. That we are so captured by individualism that we can choose whatever tribe we want to belong to, and we can choose whatever truth we want to have. And in the midst, we just have this tremendous amount of confusion and conflict, kind of differences going on. So when we're at a turning, what I'm really talking about is that there's an awful lot of evidence to suggest that the culture is now straining so deeply under the influence of the I that we are at a turning moment, that there are pressures building that want us to move back toward a we. And you talk about these pressures. There's any number of them that are out there going around. One of the ones that I love to take a look at are labor unions. During the we time, during the times of cohesion, labor unions are very strong. During the time of the I, they are very weak. They get very little support. They are often contested. And if you look at what's been happening, labor unions are now gathering more energy. They're gathering more support. We're in this swing. We're in between political parties that want to have their own particular fringe truths, and political parties that are trying to bring together red and blue states into kind of a bipartisan conversation. You've got pressures on both sides. We're at a turning. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that describe it enough?
Yeah, I would also wonder if those oscillations are different in terms of context as well. So I hear what you're saying, and I think that's something I definitely recognize as you say it is a very fascinating observation. Within me, I am a Korean American, and when I think about the more Korean communities I'm with, they tend to be more communitarian, more communal, and to the point where there may be some shunning if you veer too far away from the expectations of the community. And more when I'm with some of my American peers, there's definitely a hyper individualism, right? It's
Sure.
What do you want to do? What do you like? And there's a deep focus on the self. And In my own identity, I find an oscillation back and forth almost on a daily basis, Gil. So I wonder, this may be a US-centric conversation too. I wonder in different contexts, do they have their own forms of oscillation, and what are those degrees and differentiations as well? Those are the things that come to
Sure.
mind for me.
If there's anything US-centric about it, it may be the way that I'm talking about it. But that's a reflection of the larger whole. I mean, think about the way that the whole globe is moving toward populism and has been for a while, and feeling the tension of it. And think about what you were just saying about your identity, both as a Korean American, and then going along and being part of a group or a community that is simply American. And what you're feeling there is the absolute tension of both of them existing at the same time.
Right, right.
All of our sub-identities call us to cohesion with that subgroup, with that tribe. Okay? And at the same time, we're living in a culture that wants us only to express ourselves individually. And so we're always in that tension. And so it's only, and again, I would say that, that is further evidence of a turning. That tension is both writ small within our own lives and writ large within the culture itself. Okay, and so, where your question was going is, what then can we say about leadership? What then can we say about the congregation? And one of the things that I have argued in my book in Counterculture is that, if anything, this time of a turning really means that the church has to learn how to speak its truth. It has to find its voice. We have been captured by the culture and diminished by the culture in so many ways from the 1950s on, and that's a story of itself, and it's one that we all know, and it's fine because it was very natural, as things went along. But at this moment, there are any number of cultural voices out there that are trying to convince us to live in certain ways or under certain values. Now, if I were to capture some of that, the voice of politics is really trying to convince us that we are living in a world of fear and of scarcity. We always have to protect ourselves, that somebody is wanting to take something away from us. And this feeds into all the conversations that we have about racism. It feeds into all the conversations we have about crime and about violence and guns and abortion and all that goes. But there's a sense that there's a worldview that says that if you do not fight against others who want to take something away from you, then you will be diminished as a person. Tara Isabella Burton, in her book on strange rights, I think is a really helpful resource to take a look at the way in which the world offers us these different narratives that the world wants us to live out. The narrative of atavism, of people who believe that there was a time when we got it right, either by our DNA or by our biology, and that men were stronger than women, and that whites were, somehow better than blacks, and you have this whole history of dominance, and they'd like to return to that world. Well, that's a worldview. That's a worldview about how does the world work. One more step. And here we're going to turn to the work of Emile Durkheim, a French sociologist, who said that people will always, always, always seek meaning in their lives. They have been doing that from the very beginning of time. And he defines that search for meaning as having four components. The first is a narrative that explains how the world works, which is what we were just talking about. The second part is, how do I fit into that world? The third is, where is the community of people who see the world like I do, that I can get support and kind of nourish from them? And the fourth is, what are the rituals or the practices by which we will be able to understand or recognize each other and work? If you put those things together, the search for meaning, in terms of the narrative that you choose, help finding a way to live in that narrative, so it tells you how to live, finding a community and having rituals that will draw you closer. That is, in a sense, the way in which we live in the world. That is our search for meaning. It's time for the congregation to speak. We have our narrative. We have our way of understanding the world. We have the basic teaching of the New Testament that says that our world does not live by fear and by scarcity. Our world lives by love and by sufficiency. That if you approach things out of love, and that was the basic teaching of Jesus. If you go on to the basic teaching of Paul, it's one that everyone is included, that this covenant that was given to the Jews actually was meant for everybody. That was Paul's basic message. There are no longer any dividing walls of hostility. Everybody comes to the table. The church already has those truths. The church already has that narrative that directs our search for meaning. And we've been far too quiet about it. At a time of a turning, what does this leadership mean for me? You know, stand up and say what you believe.
Wow.
How do we do? I may have dumped too much of the truck right there.
Right. I always think about how does all of this translate into what I'm doing in the local church? And what am I seeing in the local church as both a clergy person who's living through this, but also somebody who's looking to do leadership development in general for local church leaders. I sit on our district committee on ministry, right? I sit on the board now. Like, there's lots of stuff that we're navigating in this time. And one of the things that I find that we focus a lot on as of late is like vitality numbers.
Right.
And, this concept of, well, how are you funding your ministry? How many butts do you have in the seat on Sundays? And those conversations around numeric understandings. But what I'm hearing, and when we look at sociologists and when we look at what the world looks like, the church needs to be a space in which those truths are told. And I know you wrote doing the math of mission, right, in 2014. And then in your latest book, Countercultural, one of the things that you say is this is not a time for congregations to try and fit into the culture and to worry about growing their membership and increasing their finances. So, in light of everything that you just said, can you help us unpack what that really means for us and how we can help both local church leaders and executive leadership like James and the annual conference hold together the tension of needing to be a space in which we are countercultural and when we are proclaiming our truths and where we are creating impact and we are living out what Jesus Christ calls us to do, right? We're finding our identity and understanding where we are while also navigating the practical needs of like having to fund mission and having to fund salaries and all of those things. Can you help us sort of figure out where we can land in those spaces?
The place that I would want to dig in is first in making some distinctions about the congregation that we're leading, and then we can talk a bit about the sustainability or the viability of the organization of the local church or of the annual conference. Because one of the primary lessons that I've learned from the work of Hugh Hecklow is that an institution. We talk about the institution of the church.
Mm-hmm.
That an institution is actually a set of values. It is a set of practices or disciplines that is trying to assert something that is good and healthy. And along with that is an organization and an institution like the congregation stand for something. We were just talking about that. They stand for this law of love. They stand for this messianic community to which everybody is invited. If they stand for that, and if they have practices and disciplines that bring people to that, that's the core treasure that they hold. But that core treasure, in order to find life, has to live within an organization. And that organization is what we call a congregation. So if you see what I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to separate out the institution of the church from the congregation of the church.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And the institution of the church is the pearl of great price. This is what the culture needs. It needs this dominant narrative that says that, when everybody's afraid of Pharaoh, it was really God who was going to win the day. You got to put your priorities where it is. Okay. So, the pearl of great price is the institution. It is the core truth that the Christian faith carries. And it is the congregation, which is the organization in which that truth is housed. Well, one of the arguments I make in the book of Countercultural is that this is not a day for us to continue to follow all of our anxieties about the organization of the church. 1965 was the last year in which the United Methodist Church had any net gain of members, and we have been shrinking ever since. And now with the division into two different denominations and other permutations, we have gotten even smaller, and our congregations quite naturally have gotten smaller because they are still based on a 200-year-old model of voluntary association organizations, which no longer fit this culture. We are about the last one standing.
Yep.
And then we are surprised when we're not making headway with this old form. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is it is time for us to stop being anxious about the organization as if that is our goal. The
Wow,
organization
okay.
is going to have to morph into its next form.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to have to leave behind most of what it knows about being a voluntary association organization to find its next form. And so the more we worry about how many people we have and how much money we have and how we're going to care for our property, those are all questions about resources that are supporting the organization.
Yep.
And that's where all of our anxiety has been. So what I'm trying to say is that, it's necessary to do that. You have to be responsible for those things right now, which is, the argument that I was making, in the Math of Mission.
Mm-hmm.
That in some sense, no leader can actually function if you don't know what you're working with.
Right.
You do need to know how many people are really committed to this organization. You need to know what your budget looks like. You have to know all that stuff. And what that was all about with that, doing the Master Mission was a project that we were working on at Texas Methodist Foundation to help us to get better at dealing with that stuff, understand it better.
Yeah.
Okay. But that is not where the major work of the faith is right now. The major work at the time of the turning of a culture is to remember who you are, what God is asking you to do, what is your context. It's time to stand up and to say what you actually know about how the world works and how you can be part of that.
So I'm hearing we have this issue. So we see, yes, continuing diminishing of membership in churches, shrinking finances, bringing a lot of anxiety to current congregational leaders and pastors, those who are leading local churches. And the solution I'm hearing is, one, to not be afraid, which I think is quite biblical. But then you seem to say it's really to go back to and really begin to focus on the identity, being able to articulate the identity of who we are as a congregation now. That seems to be sort of the solution that you're presenting.
Yeah. James, I think the one thing that I would, kind of tag in there too is that you said that the solution to this is now there is no solution, and that's one of the things that I know it's just the way we use language and everything. But
I'm very solution based. Yes.
Well, I got to tell you, one of my standing jokes about myself is that I am, part German, part English, and all United Methodist. So I've never been late to a meeting in my life. And I am as kind of rigid and kind of goal bound as anybody that I know. However, in this particular case, this is not a problem to be solved. This culture that we're in is simply a condition that we now have to learn how to live in. And in that living, we have to be able to ask those questions again. Walter Brueggemann, I think, so helpfully many, many years ago said that every time the Israelites came up to a moment in which they had to face themselves into the wilderness again, they had to answer two basic questions. How will we now be with God? And how will we now be with one another? And those are the questions that we have to answer. What is it that's driving our lives? And how will we be with one another in terms of community? I mean, those are deeply the questions that we really have to pursue. Now, they're to be done within the context of community. And for us, community has always been the congregation. Historically, the congregation has had multiple forms in the past since the 1700s in the United States. It has not always been the same kind of thing. It's time for us to shift again, but we don't know what the shape is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, we have to anchor ourselves in the identity and in the purpose. We are the people of God who have a way of looking at this world that is driven by love and that includes all people.
Mm.
Come see what we see. Come practice what we practice. It's time for us to stand up and start talking about that stuff instead of arguing about which of the political parties is right. You know, I mean, that's their work. That's not our work.
Yeah.
All right. You take a look at all this stuff that, whether or not we're for or against anything, that's somebody else's work. Our work is to stand up and to say who we are and what we believe and what we see. And I think that will carry the day. The form of the congregation is going to sort itself out. The problem is that, so many of our congregations are going to evaporate in the meantime. Those that stick too close to the voluntary association model, those that are too small to be able to, hire staff to live in a culture that no longer volunteers. I mean, there's any number of issues here.
So I'm trying to wrap my brain around what that would look like, right? So just because I guess I'm so used to what I would consider the traditional ecclesial model, and I engage in a lot of conversations with friends like, what are new ecclesial models? What would a congregation in 2024 look like? So I'm just curious, Gil, in your experiences, are you seeing churches and congregations, communities that are beginning to really live this out? And what do they look like? How are they different?
There are people who are watching that landscape very closely. My friends and colleagues at Texas Methodist Foundation are deeply trying to watch that. The Duke Endowment, the foundation, is supporting some experiments in North Carolina that are trying to find their way there. There are experiments going on all over the place. Fresh Expressions, which your conference and so many others are trying to use as a window to see what can happen locally. That's where a lot of this stuff is going to happen. Now, the way I tried to say that is that you can't turn to any one of those places for an answer.
Right.
But you can go to any of those places, including some of the non-ecclesial forms, such as the neighboring movement,
Mm-hmm.
and begin to take a look at what are people exploring and how is it getting some traction. I mean, one of the things that the literature and the research is beginning to point out is that the future of congregations, especially small congregations. You see, large congregations fit the culture. I mean, very large congregations fit the culture so much easier because they can be heavily staffed. And in that heavily staffing, they can be multi-programmatic and address people from multiple perspectives without having to depend upon the old volunteer model. And so for the most part, they're going to go well for a while anyhow. But the smaller congregations are going to have to find their way into the neighborhood again. And the problem is the neighborhood is essentially evaporated. People now live next to each other without knowing each other, which is far different from the way neighborhoods used to be. But congregations have to find themselves back into the neighborhood and into the lives and into the concerns of their neighbors. Instead of reaching out too far to try to change the world, congregations are going to have to learn how to be a participant in their own neighborhood right now.
Yeah.
And that's all part of what this Fresh Expressions is trying to help us into. It's all part of what the experimentation is going. So do I know any good models? Well, yeah, I know as many as you do. But the issue is everybody's out there working at it. I mean, there's a considerable number of people out there working at it. Let's watch, let's learn, let's give it a try. Let's share with each other what we're discovering.
So one of the questions that I like to ask folks, particularly who have more years in ministry than they've had out of it. Is that a nice way to say
Gabby,
it?
did you just call me an old man?
No, I just am saying, you've been doing this for quite some time. If you were to go back to your, you know, the first appointment you ever had and the
Right.
pastor that you were when you first started, what advice would you give to that Gil, given everything that you've seen and all that you have learned and all of the stuff that you have done? What would you tell that Pastor Gil?
Well, let me try it this way. If I were to go back, I think that I would no longer allow myself to see the people who are already inside the church as the clients that I had to serve.
Mm,
And I would be thinking about the fact that I had been called to a community rather than to a congregation. And that I would be working to try to work across the boundary of the congregation to bring the community and or the neighborhood and the people together around issues that had some meaning to us locally right there, and to try to approach them through the perspective of the gospel.
mm,
As a young man, I spent much too much time trying to make people happy and satisfy them with whatever they wanted.
Mm.
And that's old man speak here, Gabby.
no, starting July 1st will begin my 11th year under appointed ministry.
Mhm.
Um, and as I think back to even who I was and where the world was when I started in ministry, and one of the really powerful things that I've been hearing and reading in the last 18 months or so through conversations, both on the podcast and in some of the other programs that I'm a part of, is this need to stop leading out of spaces of anxiety, because so
Mhm.
much of our culture is we are just responding to the anxiety. And so many of our organizational structures, particularly in the local church, are anxiety bound.
Right.
And, this question of identity and the question of, who are we as pastors? Who are we as leaders? Who are we as a congregation? What has God called us to do? Like, I will always remember that the first big fight we had in my first appointment was the UMW was arguing over whether we were going to get bagels or a sheet cake for baptisms.
Right. Right.
Right. And
Right.
that was like the
Right.
big, horrible thing that lasted 3 months and nearly tore the whole church apart. And so
Sure.
I always think about, where have we learned? Where have we grown? How have we learned? How has the culture shifted? And I imagine that we're going to have a lot of new or soon to be or still navigating this next season of their lives leadership who are going to be listening to to this podcast and to this conversation. And, how do we talk to ourselves then? How do we talk to ourselves now to be part of this movement of releasing
Yeah.
ourselves from the anxiety of the organization to do what God has really called us to do?
Yeah. Right. Well, and I think what the part I'd want to push at here is to help us be honest about how much courage it takes to lead without anxiety. You know, there is that, you've got the big picture of anxiety of the culture that we're in right now, which is not clear about where it's going. It's in this turning. Is it going to lean one way or the other? And people are pushing in both directions. Clearly, I'm encouraging the congregation to push toward the we, because we overextended the I. So that's my argument there. But at the same time, let's go back to some of the realities that are part of that. That if you're in a congregation, you have been called to lead, but you have been called to lead in community. One of the things that's different about a congregation than almost any other organization is that you are called to lead the very people who are going to evaluate your leadership.
Mm.
Almost every other employment situation is one in which, when you're dealing with the client for whom you are providing services or doing whatever you're doing, they are not the people who are going to evaluate your work. You're going to be evaluated by a boss or a board or by a committee or by some other part of the organization. And so you're free to do whatever you need to do with your client, whether they like it or not. In the congregation, The same people who have called you to ministry are the ones that you are called to help change. Okay. And so why in the world would a pastor get involved with a conversation about whether it's, what did you say, donuts or what? What was the
Donuts
other
or
one?
sheet cake.
Donuts or sheet cake. Okay. So all I'm trying to say is that, in most organizations, the leader would say, well, that's an interesting question. It just doesn't matter.
Mhm.
Pick one. But you see, in a congregation, the leader, if you're going to lead, you have to know that when you go in a contest, even as minimal as that, somebody's going to be unhappy.
Mhm.
And in that unhappiness, it might undermine your leadership. It takes courage to lead without anxiety, knowing how easy it is for people to pull the rug out from under you. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what do you do to help encourage that kind of courage? Well, you help people, see their reality and begin to talk about it. One of the ways of disempowering, people, who want to pull the rug out from under you is to be able to say publicly how easy it is for them to do that and that it really doesn't help. One of the ways of doing that is encouraging leaders to have some kind of a spiritual anchor so that they can't be swayed by every blowing wind. One of the ways of doing that is encourage people to care for themselves so that they are healthy, balanced people in their lives apart from whatever else. Okay, and that's all been part of the conversation that's been going on in the church. But that's to build up courage. It's not to make everybody safe. We're not in the business of trying to make clergy safe or lay leaders safe. We're in the business of trying to help them be strong.
So many powerful statements.
Well, Gil, thank you so much for carving out your time to be here with us and have these conversations. I know that these words, these stories definitely inspired us and will inspire many church leaders who are listening in. Before we let you go, we have one question that we ask all of our guests. We are the Uncovered Dish podcast because we as Methodists love to eat and we love covered dish dinners. And so here's the last question for you. Gil, if you could have one dish for the rest of your life for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, no variations, what would that one dish be?
Boy, you have just made that one dish sound very unappealing because I eat it. Everybody's like, my gracious. I don't know. Let me take the easy route of a man my age. You might as well make it pizza.
Pizza. Any toppings
Sure, why
on your
not?
pizza?
Oh, well, sure. Pepperoni, absolutely.
Pepperoni pizza. There you go. Can't go wrong with pepperoni pizza.
How middle of the road can you get, right?
Yeah. I was going to say donuts with a little bit of sheet cake on top of it. No.
Oh, there you go. That would do
Forget.
it. That would do it for all of us. Well done.
Make everybody happy. Gil, thank you again for coming on the podcast. If folks want to get in touch with you or read some more of your content, where can they reach out to you? Where can they connect with you?
Well, you can make my email available on your podcast, Gil Rendle at gmail.com. My books are there on Amazon. Those are probably the primary ways.
Okay, awesome. Thank you again so much, Gil, for the conversation, and we hope to talk to you again soon. May you have an awesome day. Take care.
Thanks so much. Right. Bye.